Good morning, everyone, and let's continue with our discussion on T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock. I hope my screen begin. And would it have been worthwhile after all? Would it have been worthwhile after the sunsets and the dooryards and the sprinkled streets, after the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor, and this and so much more? It is impossible to say just what I mean, but as if a magic lantern threw the nerves in patterns on the screen, would it have been worthwhile if one setting a pillow or throwing off a shawl and turning toward the window should say, "That is not it at all, that is not what I meant at all"? Now, I have already mentioned the significance of the word all in this section because I have come to tell you all that is being negated here, just like the decisions, revisions, indecisions, and visions. So, and would it have been worth it after all? Would it have been worthwhile after the sunsets and the dooryards and the sprinkled streets? Here, Eliot focuses on the modern civilization, on the modern cityscape, that is, the sunsets, which are romantic and which hark us back to the opening lines. Let us go then, you and I. When the evening is spread out against the sky and the sunset happens at the evening, and dooryards. Look, a dooryard is like an opening towards the outer world. And it is very significant because Prufrock is now imagining himself in a room. And the dooryard is almost like that uh, threshold between the world of the room and the world outside. And the sprinkled streets, the restaurants which are sawdusted, the streets which are sprinkled, it kind of shows that civilization demands care, or that civilization is man made and not natural. I mean, leave a building for 100 years and trees grow on it on their own. But civilization always needs protection. After the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor. So the novels in the modern period, they were just like all those Facebook shares that we do nowadays. And those novels played a major role of the discussion of the times. So after the novels, that is, the novels show that a person is well read and therefore well versed in what is going on around them. So after the novels, after the teacups, tea is a prerogative of both the British and the Bengali alike, and therefore we know the significance of cha and adda. So the teacups become one major part of the adda culture, both in Britain and in Bengal. After the skirts that trail along the floor, so as if the woman is leaving her trail along the floor, as if she's creating a road to herself, or the residue of a road at the wake of leaving. So after the skirts that trail along the floor, and this and so much more. And look, then Eliot puts a dash. And this dash kind of creates a pause, and this pauses to participate in the experiences of a party scene. This pauses us to participate to the experiences of a party scene. And this so much more can be anything that you can think of a gathering, of a get together, of a party scene. It is impossible to say just what I mean, because he is dealing with, number one, an imaginative situation. You see, the future is dangerous because we can only imagine the future. We can think about the future and we can overthink the future. And secondly, it is impossible to say just what I mean, because Prufrock is now dealing with images. He is dealing with simulations in his mind, and he does not know which one will befall in the real. So it is impossible to say just what I mean. But as if a magic lantern threw the nerves in patterns on a screen. Now, this is a specific reference. Basically, this is an image from Eliot's own boyhood reading, and his father took the St. Louis Globe Democrat. Okay, this was a magazine, the St. Louis Globe Democrat, and in a specific edition of January 1897, there was a printed article called Seeing the Brain. Now, the illustration showed a man seated in front of a powerful light which throws a patterned X ray of his brain onto a screen. And look, Eliot says that as if a magic lantern threw the nerves in patterns on the screen. Now, when he talks about nerves, we are once again reminded of Arthur Symons and that book that I referred to in the previous class. And Symons mentions a very beautiful thing, and he says, it is an art of the nerves, this art of Laforgue. So, talking about Jules Laforgue, Symons says, it is an art of the nerves, this art of Laforgue. And it is what all art would tend towards if we followed our nerves on all their journeys. Now, you must remember that modernist writing with the people like Eliot, with Joyce, modernist writing was becoming cerebral and was becoming divorced from the sensuous exuberance of the romantics. So now nobody uh, treats a bird like, if I see you, I will have a heart attack. My heart aches and a rousing numbness pains my sense. Nobody writes like that anymore. Now poetry has become much, much more cerebral. Now then he says that would it have been worthwhile if I look at it cerebrally? If I look at it viscerally, this visceral image of the mind at its work, this probes Eliot question, would it have been worthwhile? And then Prufrock says, if one settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl, and look, when the moment is pushed to its crisis, then what happens is that we tend to lose focus of what of basically we tend to focus more on the trivial things because that moment heightens our senses. And then he says, if one's settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl, so these are all basically defense mechanisms. These are all, the person is not settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl, but rather the person is shifting between positions and trying to find a comfortable foothold in a moment of crisis. And turning toward the window, and look, the person does not look at the speaker's eyes. The person in question does not look at Prufrock, and therefore this woman is evasive of the question that Prufrock has put in front of her. Should say that is not it at all, that is not what I meant at all. And look, here she negates the speech of Lazarus. Lazarus came back from the dead, and this woman is actually putting their relationship to death. So it's absolutely the reverse journey of Lazarus. And therefore, this becomes so very significant. And look, now Prufrock is in a dilemma. In the horns of a dilemma, he is suffering from to be or not to be. For Prufrock, now that is the overwhelming question. And this was spoken by none other than Shakespeare's Prince Hamlet. And look, Prufrock reverts back to Hamlet. No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I am an attendant lord, one that will do to swell up progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool, deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse, at times indeed almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool. And here we cannot but uh, basically think of the Prince Hamlet, Hamlet the Prince of Denmark, the character himself. Basically, Hamlet was given to a sort of self scrutiny and was tormented by an indecisiveness. And thus, Prufrock's sudden exclamation is cut short by the Hamletesque soliloquy that he has just indulged in, and to assert his own subordinate, unheroic role in life, he deliberately jumps from Hamlet to Dante. Dante was one of Eliot's favorite sources, and the reference that I am drawing over here is from the Inferno, Canto 2, line 42, where he says, I am not Aeneas and I am not Paul. Now, Dante's words are a retort to Virgil, who has just tried to reassure him about the safety of their path with the fact that Aeneas and St. Paul have already been that way. Now, basically, what happens over here is that there have been other sources to this. No, I am not Prince Hamlet. For instance, in 1956, a certain professor whose name was Seymour L. Gross, Seymour L. Gross, he suggested to Eliot that the line was taken from a letter of Lawrence Sterne, where the wording is identical, apart from the opening word no. And Eliot wrote back that he had never read Sterne's letter. Would he have given the same answer to another suggestion that he was alluding to a line in the essay by Walter Pater? The name of the essay is Shakespeare's English Kings, and the essay was written by Walter Pater in 1889. The name of the essay is Shakespeare's English Kings. And in this essay, Pater writes the uh, sentence, no, Shakespeare's kings are not, nor are meant to be, great men. And the passage continues in terms which are very Prufrockian. Now, what happens over here is that these might have inspired Eliot, but even more than that, what is very important to me is that according to Eliot, this entire passage, that is starting from here to here, this passage, according to Eliot, and I believe Eliot mentioned this, according to Eliot, this passage is very Laforgian because it was one of the early fragments written at Harvard. This passage was written around February of 1910. And during this time, Eliot was severely under the influence of Lafforgue. And during Eliot's stay, his long stay throughout Europe, Prufrock was constructed step by step. And this passage, especially, is very important because this passage reminds the Laforgian influences on Eliot. And why is it so very important? Is because Ezra Pound, who was Eliot's good friend and the editor of The Wasteland, Ezra Pound tried to get Eliot to remove this Hamlet section. However, as he wrote to Harriet Monroe in January 1915, that it is an early and cherished bit and T.E. won't give it up. And as it is the only portion of the poem that most readers will like at first reading, I don't see that it will do much harm. Now, once again, when I comment on this, Simons comes to my mind, Arthur Simons, because in the symbolist movement in literature, uh, in my book, page 111, Simons uh, quotes Laforgue's thoughts on Hamlet. Okay, and I have found that quotation. I have kept that quotation for you. So, in that quotation, let me read out the quotation and you decide for yourself whether you think that this uh, stanza is more Laforgian than the other sources that I have already mentioned. Simons writes, the prose and verse of Laforgue, scrupulously correct, making subtle use of colloquialism, slang, neologism, technical terms for their allusive, their factitious, and their reflected meanings, with which one can play very seriously. The verse is alert, troubled, swaying, deliberately uncertain, hating rhetoric so piously that it prefers and finds its piquancy in the ridiculous with a familiarity of manner as of one talking languidly in a low voice, the lips always tensed and into a slightly bitter smile. Now, F.O. Matheson, uh, F.O. Matheson, uh, who is one of the greatest critics of Eliot's poetry, uh, F.O. Matheson observes that Prufrock, in the movement of its verse, its repetitions and echoes, and even in its choice of theme, seems all of Eliot's poems to have been written uh, most immediately under Laforgue's stimulus, though brought to a finished perfection of form which Laforgue's more impromptu verse scarcely attained. Now, so you see, they are all pointing at Laforgue more than they're pointing at these other sources. But what is so very interesting to me is this line: no, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. Look, there is a triple negative: no, not, nor. A double negative means a positive, but a triple negative, what does it mean? Does it mean too positive or negative? Or is it just a quibble, just a wordplay? And here the critics are not unanimous. So you can take it in a very positive sense, you can take it in a negative sense, you can take it in a doubtful sense, but that is not my point. My point is that if you isolate this part, nor was meant to be, and look, to be or not to be, I think that Eliot was suggesting that Hamlet, dear Hamlet, nor was meant to be. Since I'm not Prince Hamlet, I do not have this choice of to be, but rather my choice is not to be. So, unlike Hamlet, Prufrock is not in that position of life, not in that stature of life, and for him, nor was meant to be. I am an attendant lord, one that will do to swell up progress. Now, progress in Elizabethan England, and often represented on stage, was the ceremonial journey of the nobility or royalty in full pomp. Uh, to swell up progress, start a scene or two, just like in the opening scenes of other playwrights. Nothing major happens. Some lesser important characters come, they discuss certain things, and then the major characters come and they pick up. But since he talks about this with reference to Shakespeare, so what happens over here is that Shakespeare's opening scenes usually strike the keynote of the play. And therefore, Prufrock kind of, in a way, mentions that he is also going to strike the keynote of his own play, but this is a sense of humility that covers him, that surrounds him, that shrouds him, and he wishes to remain in this humility. And look, he says, swell a progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool. So Prufrock sees himself as a tool. So he slowly looks at himself from an objective perception. And this is what, since I have also taught you tradition and the individual talent, this is what is the impersonality in poetry. Prufrock is experiencing the entire thing, but Eliot is reading the poem just like a third person, like you and I. So look, advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool. Deferential, glad to be of use. So the utility part remains. Politic, that is, um, it is used in a very archaic sense, and in the archaic sense, politic means diplomatic, but with an eye for advantage. Politic cautious. The word cautious is derived from cautelous. The word cautelous, which means crafty, cunning, as is used by Shakespeare himself. Meticulous, this is also used in the obsolete sense of being fearful. These are all used in their obsolete senses. That is, if he is not fearful, then he is not a good attending lord in the service of his prince. And then look, he says, full of high sentence but a bit obtuse. Now, full of high sentence is basically suggesting lofty sentiments and learned talk, a description of the conversation of the scholarly clerk of Oxford in the general prologue of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So, in the general prologue, there is a character. In the general prologue of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, there is a character called the clerk at Oxford. And about him, Chaucer uses this expression. Okay, now look, if you look at these three lines, you'll see that here we have a description that calls to mind the long winded and moralizing Polonius of Hamlet, because these are epithets that best suit Polonius. And remember, I already told you I should have been a pair of ragged claws cuttling across the floors of Silent Seal. There I mentioned a section from Hamlet where uh, Hamlet is simulating madness, and he addresses the old courtier Polonius as, "For you yourself, sir, should be old as I am, if like a crab you could go backwards." And there I talked about the concealed allusion. So what happens is that here Prufrock is using the high sentence deliberately, and he is deliberately referring again in a hidden allusion to Polonius, but a bit obtuse at times, indeed almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool. And the fool was a stock figure in the Elizabethan drama, we know. He was often a court entertainer whose patter and seeming nonsense contained a paradoxical wisdom. For instance, Yorick, the court jester in Hamlet. And Hamlet remembers him when, uh, in Act 5, Scene 1, in the Gravedigger scene, when Yorick is dead for almost 23 years. And Hamlet recalls him from his boyhood with affection and pity. Now, this line is very close to Eliot. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Now, Eliot said that this line reminds words of Falstaff. Henry IV, Part 1, one of the greatest plays of Shakespeare. Henry IV, one of Shakespeare's historical plays. Henry IV, Part 1, uh, Act 2, Scene 4. Here, uh, Falstaff says, "There live not three good men unhanged in England, and one of them is fat and grows old." So this is Falstaff's line. And look, just like Prufrock, here we have false stuff or stuff. So the quibbling goes on, the wordplay goes on. But basically, I think that the origin of it may lie closer to the time of the poem's composition, in the statement that to live is to grow old, which Bergson talked about in his introduction to metaphysics. And I shall wear the bottom of my trousers rolled. These would be trousers with turn-ups. That is in America, which are called cuffs. And this was coming to fashion during that time. Also, in an anecdote, I heard that George Santayana, who was Eliot's professor, on the day that he retired, he said these lines: I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled." So there are several references to high and low culture, to the common and to the magnanimous, the grand and the grandiose and the meager. Now look, shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare eat a peach? Shall I wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach? I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think they will sing to me. Now, shall I part my hair behind? In his autobiographical essay, Ushant, in his autobiographical essay called Ushant in 1952, Eliot's Harvard contemporary, Conrad Aiken, he was a very good friend of Eliot as well, and many of his contemporaries. So Conrad Aiken uh, tells us that a sensation was caused when one of their fellow students returned from Paris in exotic left bank clothing and with his hair parted behind. And clearly at the time, such a hairstyle was regarded as daringly bohemian. Now, in this last section, Do I dare eat a peach? Because Prufrock is growing old and eating a peach, digesting a peach was very difficult. And I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. Now there are pictures of Eliot you wearing white flannel trousers and walking upon the beach when he grew old actually. So this is a very interesting reference. But what is so very interesting to me in this is the fact that starting from here to the end of the poem, we see that in Dante's Inferno, Ulysses sails to the end of the world in pursuit of knowledge. Okay. And during this voyage, he was spellbound by the siren's song. And the mock epic strain of Prufrock is emphasized in this final passage as Eliot elevates the poetic lyricism and intensity. And this "do I dare eat a peach, shall I part my hair behind," these are all autobiographical insistences because Eliot himself did such things on occasions. And uh, when he says, "I have heard mermaids singing each to each, I do not think they will sing to me," uh, this is a reference to a poem called Song by John Donne. This section. Basically, in this poem, there is a line called "Teach me to hear mermaids singing." And this is one of the series of challenges which is richly poetic and yet unattainable. And here we see that the English poet provides the obvious allusion. But once again, for Eliot and his friends, it may have been coupled with a reference to the symbolist movement in literature. At the close of the chapter on Gerard de Nerval, so Arthur Symons' book, and there is a chapter on Gerard. A line is quoted from his poem El Desdicado. The name of the poem is El Desdicado or Desdicado, whatever you call it. El Desdicado or El Desdicado means the disinherited. And here there is a line: "I have dreamed in the cave where the siren swims." And Eliot refers to this poem in one of his notes to the Wasteland, especially to line 429. And look, here we see a very beautiful reversal. "I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think they will sing to me." So this is a very ironic reversal because the Homeric sirens, who are equated with the Elizabethan mermaids, traditionally tried to lure heroes from their great tasks. For instance, if you read Spencer's Fairy Queen, uh, you will see that in book 2, uh, Canto 11, you will see that, sorry, Canto 12, book 2, Canto 12, in The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, you will see in book 2, Canto 12, the sirens lure uh, the heroes from their tasks. Also, Samuel Daniel has a poem called Ulysses and the Siren. There also you will find the same reference. But before Prufrock was published in the Poetry magazine, its editor Harriet Monroe voiced some criticism, which Ezra Pound countered in a later dated 31st January 1915. Perhaps on the suggestion of Eliot, I do not know. Okay, I do not know for sure. Mr. Prufrock, okay, I'll read it later. First, let me finish reading this section. I have seen them riding seaward on the wave, combing the white hair of the waves blown back. When the wind blows the water white and black, we have lingered in the chambers of the sea by seagulls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown. So I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the hair of the waves blown back. When the wind blows the water white and black, up till now we have seen barely seen any color apart from the yellow smoke and the brown fog. So black, white, yellow, brown, these were the colors that we were seeing. So these were basically reminiscent of the black and white film and of the sepia format, which was very popular back in that day. But now we are seeing red and brown. So more colors are coming in. So this is very cinematic as well. Now, till human voices wake us and we drown, this drowning image has been very difficult for many people to accept, as if Prufrock was in a trance and now he has to wake up. And it is this wake up call which is very distressing to many people. And it was also distressing to the editor of the poetry magazine where the poem was initially published. Okay. And therefore, there has been a lot of criticism regarding this. And Harriet Monroe, the editor, uh, called Ezra Pound and said that uh, this poem ends with a dying fall. And Pound, perhaps on the insistence of Eliot, said that no, this uh, poem does not end with a dying fall. Basically, Pound replied, and I have that letter. It was dated 31st January 1915. And he says, Mr. Prufrock does not go off at the end. It is a portrait of failure or of a character which fails, and it would be false art to make it end on a note of triumph. I dislike the paragraph about Hamlet, but it is an early and cherished bit, and T.E. won't give it up. And as it is the only portion of the poem that most readers will like at first reading, I don't see that it will do much harm. For the rest, a portrait satire on futility can't end by turning that quintessence of futility, Mr. P, into a reformed character breathing out fire and ozone. And when Prufrock was first published in 1915, it concluded with a line of dots. Now, I do not know if this typography is faithful to the manuscript, but it may be pointing to an incompleteness to the poem, a supposition that seems to be supported by a letter to the Times Literary Supplement in 1960, saying that in 1912 he made some additions to the poem but had enough recollection of the suppressed verses to remain grateful to Mr. Aiken for advising me to suppress them. And the American poet and novelist Conrad Aiken was Eliot's closest friend at Harvard, and therefore perhaps we shall never know that what those lines were. So you see, basically, Prufrock's love song is the propaganda of futility, which culminates in the sudden burst of human voices. E.M. Forster says something very interesting. He says that it sang of people who are ineffectual and weak. Now, the monologue that Prufrock had indulged into closes with Prufrock's criticism, and his love song is peculiarly modern, mad, subdued, sweet at times, and the dreams are permitted but not the destination, and therefore not the destiny itself. So, the bewildering questions and the remarks that follow the hysteria that Prufrock has quite undergone. basically complete the sense of Prufrock. And when we were students, we had to study André Gide, a French writer, and he has a novel called La Porte Étroite, or the Straight Gate, or Straight is the Gate. André Gide, Straight is the Gate. And Dr. Chinmoy Guho has a very beautiful translation of it in Bengali called Shirno Torun. And towards the end of that, uh, the central characters, two of the central characters, they are sitting in the darkness, and one of them says, "Cholo jege uthi, come on, let's wake up." And then the servant brings in a lamp, and as if in that light of that lamp, they're drowning. Now, when I hear this word, "till human voices wake us and we drown," I'm often reminded of that scene. Now, Carl Gustav Jung says that one cannot despairing of life. And towards the end, what I believe is that Prufrock secures togetherness with himself and his audiences at the incoherence of a conscious futility or failure. Prufrock somewhere acknowledges that he is a failure. And this is what Ezra Pound also seemed to hint. And therefore, the poem does not end with a dying fall. The poem was meant to end with a dying fall. And therefore, Prufrock truly remains the proof rock that he was meant to be. He truly remains the touchstone, and he does not betray his audiences. If he had come across a full circle, then he would have betrayed his audiences. But I do not believe that Prufrock does so. Eliot does not believe that Prufrock does so. Ezra Pound does not believe that Prufrock does so. Neither does Harriet Monroe. And I hope that after such efforts on reading this poem, you also do not believe that he does so. So, with this, I'll end my discussions on Prufrock. In the next class, we'll be studying the preludes. Thank you so much. Have a good day.